Hi, it's me again, Miss Brock, and Miss Broccoli, or if you know me as Miss Christy. And this is a book about teaching. And so I like art, and I like teaching, and I like Jesus, and I like broccoli, and you know all the things I like, some of them. But this is kind of a feeling that I like, and I wanted to see if you've ever felt this feeling. So we're going to talk about Thank You, Mr. Faulkner, and it's by Patricia Polacco. And it is a book about a little girl and a teacher. Let's get started. The grandpa held the jar of honey so that all the family could see. Then dipped the ladle into it. And drizzled honey on the cover of a small book. The little girl had just turned 5. Stand up, little one, he cooed. I did this for your mother, your uncles, your older brother, and now for you. Then he handed the book to her. Taste. She dipped her finger into the honey and put it into her mouth. What does that taste? The grandma asked. What is the taste? The grandma asked. The little girl answered, sweet. And all the family said in a single voice, yes, and so is knowledge, but knowledge is like the bee that made the sweet honey. You have to chase it through the pages of a book. The little girl knew that the promise to read was at last hers. Soon, she was going to learn to read. Tricia, the little girl in the family, grew up loving books. Her school teacher mother read to her every night. Her red-headed brother brought his books home from school and shared them. And whenever she visited the family farm, her grandmother and grandfather read to her by the stone fireplace. And when she turned 5 and went to kindergarten, most of all, she hoped to read. Each day she saw the kids in first grade across the hall reading. And before the year was over, some of the kids in her own class began to read. Not Tricia. She still loved being at school because she could draw. The other kids would crowd around her and watch her do her magic with her crayons. In first grade, you'll learn to read, her brother said. First grade, Tricia sat in a circle with the other kids. They were holding Our Neighbor, their first reader, sounding out letters and words, and they said, boy, and look. The teacher smiled at them when they put all the sounds together and got the word right. But when Tricia looked at the page, all she saw were wiggly shapes. And when she tried to sound out the words, the other kids laughed at her. Tricia, what are you looking at? In the book, they'd say. I'm reading, she'd say back to them. But her teacher would move on to the next person. Always when it was her turn to read, her teacher had to help her with every single word. And while the other kids moved up in the lines to second readers and third readers and stayed alone, and she stayed alone in Our Neighbor, Tricia began to feel different. She began to feel dumb. The harder the words got for the little girl, the more and more time she spent drawing. How she loved to draw, or just sitting and dreaming, or when she could go for walks with her grandmother. On summer days, she and her grandmother were walking together in a small wood behind their farm. It was twilight. The air was sweet and warm. Fireflies were just coming up from the grass. And as they walked, Tricia said, Grandma, do you think I'm different? Of course, her grandmother answered. To be different is the miracle of life. You'll see, all of those little fireflies, everyone is different. You think I'm smart? Tricia didn't feel smart. Her grandmama hugged her. You're different. You are the smartest, quickest, dearest little thing ever. Right then, the little girl felt safe in her grandma's arms. Reading didn't matter so much. Tricia's grandmother used to say that the stars were holes in the sky. They were the light of the heavens coming from the other side. And she used to say that someday she would be on the other side. where the light comes from. One evening, they lay on the grass together and counted the lights from heaven. You know, her grandma said, all of us will go there someday. Hang on to the grass, or you'll be lifted right up off the ground, and you'll be there. They laughed, and they both hung on to the grass. But it was not long after that night that her grandmother must have let go of the grass, because she went to where the lights were, on the other side. And not long after that, Trisha's grandpa let go of the grass too. School seemed harder and harder now. Reading was just plain torture. When Sue Ellen read her page, or Tommy Bob read his page, they read so easily that Trish would watch the tops of their head to see if something was happening to their head that wasn't happening to hers. The numbers were the hardest thing of all to read. She never added anything right. Line the numbers up before you add them, the teacher would say. But when Trish tried the numbers, they looked like a stack of blocks, wobbly and ready to fall. She just knew she was dumb. And then one day, her mother announced that she had gotten a teaching job in California, a long way from the family farm in Michigan. Even though her grandma and grandpa were gone, the little girl didn't want to move. Maybe, though, the teachers and the kids in her new school wouldn't know how dumb she was. She and her mother and her brother moved across country in a two-tone 1949 Plymouth. It took 5 days. But at the new school, it was the same. When she tried to read, she stumbled over the words. The cat ran. She was reading like a baby in 3rd grade. And when her teacher read along with them and called on Tricia for the answer, she gave the wrong answer every time. Hey, dummy, the boy called out on the playground. How come you're so dumb? The other kids stared near him, and they laughed. Tricia could feel the tears burning in her eyes. She longed to go back to her grandparents' farm in Michigan. Now Tricia wanted to go to school less and less. I have a sore throat, she'd say to her mother, or I have a stomach ache, she dreaded. She dreaded more and more and drew more and more, and she hated school. Then when Tricia started the 5th grade, the school was all abuzz. There was a new teacher. He was tall and elegant, and everybody loved his striped coat and his slick gray pants. He wore the neatest clothes. All the usual teachers' pets gathered around him. Stevie Joe and Alice Marie and Davy and Michael and Lee, but right from the start, it didn't seem to matter to Mr. which kids were the cutest, or the smartest, or the best at anything. Mr. Falker would stand behind Tricia whenever she was drawing and whisper, "This is brilliant, absolutely brilliant. You know how talented you are?" When he said this, every kid who teased her would turn around in their seat and look at her drawing, but they still laughed whenever she gave a wrong answer. And one day, she had to stand up and read, which she hated. She was stumbling through a page in Charlotte's Web, and the page was going all fuzzy. When the kids began to laugh out loud, Mr. Falker, in his plaid jacket and butterfly tie, said, "Stop! Are all of you so perfect that you can look at another person and find fault with her?" That was the last day anyone laughed out loud or made fun of her, all except Eric. He sat behind Tricia for 2 whole years, but he seemed almost to hate her. Tricia didn't know why. He waited by the door of the classroom for her and pulled her hair. He waited for her on the playground, leaned into her face and called her Toad. Tricia was afraid to turn any corner or for fear Eric would be there. She felt completely alone. The only time she was really happy was when she was around Mr. Falker. He would let her erase the blackboards. Only the best students got to do that. He patted her on the back whenever she got something right, and he looked hard and mean at any kid who teased her. But the nicer Mr. Falker was to Tricia, the worse Eric treated her. He got all the other kids to wait for her on the playground or in the cafeteria or even in the bathroom and to jump out and call her stupid. Tricia began to believe them, and she discovered if she asked to go to the bathroom just before recess, she could hide inside the stairwell during the free time and not have to go outside at all. In that dark place, she felt completely safe. But one day at recess, Eric followed her to the secret place. "Have you become a mole?" He laughed and pulled her into the hall and danced around her. "Dumbbell, dumbbell, maggoty old dumbbell." Krista buried her head in her hands and curled up into a ball, and suddenly she heard footsteps. It was Mr. Falker. He marched Eric down to the office. When he came back again, he said softly, "What was he teasing you about, little one?" "I don't know," Tricia struggled. Tricia was sure that Mr. Falker believed that she could read. She had learned to memorize what the kids next to her was reading, or she would wait for Mr. Falker to help her with the sentence, and then she'd say the same thing he did. "Good," he'd say. Then one day Mr. Falker asked her to stay after school to help wash the blackboards. He put on music and brought out a little sandwich as they worked and talked. All at once, he said, "Let's play a game. I'll shout out letters, and you write them on the board with a sponge as quick as you can." "A," he shouted. She wiped a watery A. "8," he shouted. She made a watery 8. Then 14, then 3, then D, and then M, then Q, he shouted out. He shouted out many letters and numbers. He walked up behind her, and together they looked at the board. It was a watery mess. Tricia knew that none of the letters or numbers looked like what they should. She threw the sponge down and tried to run. But Mr. Falker caught her by the arm and sank to his knees in front of her. "Poor baby," he said. "You think you're dumb, don't you? How awful for you. Be so lonely and afraid." She sobbed. "But little one, don't you understand? You don't see letters or numbers the way other people do. And you've gotten through school all this time. You fooled many good teachers." He smiled at her. That cunning look and smartness and such bravery. Then he stood up, finished washing the board. "We're going to change all that, girl. We're going to read. I promise you that." Now, almost every day after school, she met with Mr. Falker and Miss Plessy, a reading teacher. They did a lot of things she didn't even understand. At first, she made circles in the sand and then a big sponge circle on the blackboard, going from left to right. Another day, they flicked letters on the screen, and Tricia shouted them out. Still other days, she worked with wooden blocks and built words, letters, 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 words, 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 always sounding them out. And that felt good. But though she read words, she hadn't read a whole sentence. And deep down, she still felt dumb. And one spring day, it had been 3 months or 4 since they had started. Mr. Falker put a book in front of her. She had never seen it before. He picked up a paragraph in the middle of the page and pointed at it. It was almost as if it was magic, or as if light had poured into her brain. The words in the sentences started to take shape on the page as they had never before. She marched them off to... Slowly she read a sentence, and then another, and she finally read a paragraph. And she understood the whole thing. She didn't notice that Mr. Falkner and Mrs. Plessy had tears in their eyes. That night, Tricia ran home without stopping to catch her breath. She bounded up the front steps, threw open the door, ran through the dining room to the kitchen. She climbed on the cupboard, grabbed her jar of honey, and then she went into the living room and found the book on the shelf, the very book that her grandpa had showed her so many years ago. She spooned the honey on the cover, tasted the sweetness, and said to herself, "The honey is sweet, and so is knowledge, but knowledge is like a bee who made the honey. It has to be chased through the pages of a book." Then she held the book, honey and all, close to her chest. She could feel the tears rolling down her cheek, but they weren't tears of sadness. She was happy, so very happy. The rest of the year became an odyssey of discovery and adventure for the little girl. She learned to love school. I know because that little girl was me, Patricia Plocko. She saw Mr. Falkner again some 30 years later at a wedding. I walked up to him and introduced myself. At first he had difficulty placing me. Then I told him who I was and how he had changed my life so many years ago. He hugged me and asked what I was doing for a living. "Why, Mr. Falkner," I answered, "I make books for children." "Thank you, Mr. Falkner. Thank you." Isn't that a precious story? So some of you know that I have something I call dyslexia, but it's mostly called dyslexia, and I often tease about why would they give names to people that have spelling difficulties that are so hard to spell. So dyslexia, dyslexia, dysgraphia, those are all starting to be discovered. And when I was growing up, I was able to get through school by drawing pictures as well to my teachers. And they didn't catch I couldn't read till I was 9th grade. Even in 7th grade, I was still spelling my name wrong. So if you struggle with reading, like me and Patricia, I wasn't even good at drawing like Patricia. I just didn't have anything going for me. So just know, if you struggle with reading, it might be something going on with you. And it might not. You may just not like reading. But I hope you begin to read. And she has lots more books. And I don't have time to read this one, but if you like this one, you're gonna love this one even more. And I get these at the Cullman Public Library, and this one's called The Junkyard Wonders. I hope you go check it out, and I hope you begin to love reading, and I hope you get good at it too. As I once heard it said, when you read, it's how you learn to be alone. And I think sometimes it's good to learn how to be alone. I hope you're alone now and you're getting ready for bed. Have a good night.